Well, this morning we are continuing in the third in our sermon series on salvation, the prequel. Now, as we're coming up towards the Advent season, which starts on the first Sunday of December, I thought it would be interesting to ask, well, what was God doing all the time before that? And so our story starts about 1,000 years before Jesus actually was born. And we see where God has begun working mightily in some very important ways. For 2 weeks, we examined the story of Ruth, a very faithful, devoted woman who, through her devotion and her declaring her allegiance to God, eventually became like the grandmother of King David. Now this morning we're going to continue the story as we see another piece of it unfolding, again with a woman named Hannah this time. And we're going to see how her attitudes and her love and her devotion to God allowed God to work through her. And we're going to see how God brought her salvation even as he was bringing salvation to Israel and later on to every one of us. So I want to start by reading a little bit of her story from 1 Samuel chapter 1. It says, "There was a certain man from the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Elkanah, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other one Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where were also ministering the 2 sons of Eli the priest. When Elkanah sacrificed, he passed helpings from the sacrificial meal around to his wife Peninnah and all her children. But he also always gave an especially generous helping to Hannah because he loved her so much, and because God had not given her children. But her rival wife taunted her cruelly, rubbing it in and never letting her forget that God had not given her children. Every time she went to the sanctuary of God, she could expect to be taunted. Hannah was reduced each time to tears and had no appetite, and this went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her until she wept and could not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" One time when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." She kept on praying to the Lord. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk, and he said to her, "How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant to be a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Then Eli answered, he said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." And she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived, and she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, which means God has heard, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." When the man Elkanah went up with his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go this time. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "Do what seems best to you," Elkanah, her husband, told her. "Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, a half a bushel of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. May God add his blessings to this reading and the hearing of this word. So this story is a story of salvation. Salvation for Hannah, but also for all of Israel. And indeed, so many of her own life circumstances seem to echo that of the nation of Israel as well. She was a helpless, vulnerable, childless woman. Let that sink in for just a minute. Helpless, vulnerable, and childless. Now, as you remember from the sermons on Ruth, back in those days, a woman had to have heirs if indeed she was to be cared for in her old age if her husband died. In those days, the line of the father must continue through her. And for a woman not to have children, she'd often be an object of ridicule and scorn, because in those days they felt that if she didn't have children, God was angry with her. And so we look at the situation and we see that we've got Elkanah the husband. And from the way the text reads, it was pretty obvious that Hannah was the one he loved, that he fell in love with first, that he married first. Then later, Peninnah. And probably very similar to the story of Abraham and Sarah, who, when God had made the promise to give him a son, and Sarah was barren, he took up Hagar to be his wife also. Hagar was the servant girl of Sarah. And as we read that story, we see it borne out with a lot of animosity and bitterness from one woman toward the other, especially because the lesser wife, as it were, was the one who had children. And in this particular story, it was just exactly the same. Hannah was barren, but Peninnah had children. At this point, it looked like she was the one who would gain the inheritor's portion, the one whose sons would inherit everything from Elkanah. But Elkanah loved Hannah more. And so you could see the bitterness and the anxiety that was developing between them, until the point where this one time they'd gone up to Shiloh, Hannah stands up. She goes over to the side, and that's where Eli the priest catches her praying. And he thinks she's drunk until she explains what was going on. Now, this was a woman, she and her husband, who were devoted to God. Every year without fail, they came up to the temple at Shiloh and they offered their sacrifices. And obviously, Hannah had a very strong relationship with God. And so this time when she is praying to God, and isn't it amazing? It always seems to be at just the perfect time in God's plan. She's praying to God. She says, "Oh God, give me a son. Let my scorn be taken away. Bring salvation to me." And God is thinking, aha, this is one I can work with. This is one whose heart is as my own heart. And so after she prays and after she makes that vow of dedication, and I'll have you notice the two readings that George did a little bit ago, one out of Numbers, the other one out of Matthew. These are examples of the Nazirite vow that Hannah was making on Samuel's behalf, on her young child. It was no razor would touch his head, never would he drink. And there were several other things in there. And you'll notice that when we come upon John the Baptist, the one who was going to anoint the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, he was living as a Nazirite, living in the wild. You know, he would have looked like somebody wild and crazy and homeless. But he was living under a Nazirite vow, dedicated entirely to the service of God. And so in time then, God honored his promise to Hannah. She became pregnant. She had a son, someone who could carry on her lineage and the name. No longer was she an object of ridicule and of scorn, and her own salvation was guaranteed then. Salvation in the society around them. You may remember the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, John the Baptist's parents, how they had been barren all the way through up into their old age. And she also was an object of ridicule and scorn because the townsfolk thought that God was mad at her and therefore they should shun her. And how she also was restored when she had a son, John the Baptist, who also was a key piece of God's salvation plan. But one of the things that I think is the most remarkable about Hannah's story is the way she kept the vow that she had made to God. And I want you, so many times we get in trouble, we get in a tight spot, or we need some mighty healing, and we make all sorts of promises to God. Oh God, if you'll heal me. Oh God, if you'll help me get this job. Oh God, if you'll, whatever it is that we need to be rescued from. I will do this. I'll go to church every single week. Oh God, I will tithe every week. In fact, I'll even give more than I need to. Oh God, I'll sing in the choir. Oh God, I'll serve on PPR and on trustees. But then how many times after the situation is past do we forget and let God down? And I think of the courage that Hannah had after all these years of not having a child, not having a son, finally having a son. What does she do when he's 3 years old? About the age where us guys are starting to finally think, now I can do something with this one. She takes him up, along with the offerings, presents him to Eli at the temple, said, he's all yours now. Wow, what courage would that take? To take that child that she had given birth to after all those years, that she had nursed and fallen in love with. And she kept her promise to God. And I thought, this has got to be an incredible example for all the rest of us. That when we make a vow to God and God answers our prayer, we keep our vow no matter what. Knowing and trusting that God, in honoring our vows, is going to lift us up and not leave us destitute, but is going to lift us up and allow us to be part of His salvation story. And so as we go a little bit further on in the story of Samuel, of course he grows up. He becomes also a priest. In fact, he becomes the last of the great judges of Israel and the very first of the great prophets of Israel. And one day, and we'll take some of this up next week, but one day he will go up to a young, stinky shepherd boy, scrawny and the least of all of the sons of Jesse, and anoint him as the king over Israel, and make a vow that there would always be one of David's lineage on the throne of Israel to the end of the age. And who was one of his greatest descendants? Jesus the Messiah. Let's pray. O Lord, let us learn from these great women, Ruth and Hannah. Let us have the same courage that they had to approach you with bold prayers, but especially to fulfill our part of the bargain, our part of the vows. O Lord, lead us where you will. Love us, lift us up, and rescue us, and help us also through our ministries to be part of your great salvation plan. Bless us in the name of our great, glorious King, King Jesus. Amen. God